on tap. And yes, we are recording, and we like to put our talks by our featured speakers up on our website. And again, thank you for joining us. Really looking forward to tonight. And for those of you who have been with us before, this will sound like a pretty familiar structure. For those new to us, I want to just let you know a little bit about what we're up to. We have two fabulous speakers. They will each give about a 7 or so minute talk. We're not going to cut them off if they keep going a little longer than that. And I'm going to introduce each one. And then there will be time for questions. And if you have questions while our speakers are talking, please feel free to put those in the chat. And we will have time for question and answers after both of our speakers. And then comes the more group informal part of the evening, which is our breakout rooms. You are each going to be put into a breakout room. These will be, I think, relatively small groups with a facilitator, and they will lead you on a very interesting discussion. And then we'll do that for 20, 25 minutes or so, and then all come back together and talk about what you discussed. And each breakout room will have a slightly different scenario to talk through and talk about that's connected, let's say, to the material that our speakers will be delivering to us tonight. And I want to mention that this is a program of NEREID, which is all about Earth and space data and education. It's a program of AUI, Associated Universities, Inc. And we do have a website where you can find out more. And if nobody else does, I'll put that in our chat in a second. And that's also where you can find all the other recordings from our previous 3 Convergence on Tap conversations. And again, I want to focus just for a second on the word convergence. This is a relatively new, well, in some ways not so new, but an idea that these events kind of focus on. So we are taking a topic and looking at 2 what may have been previously thought of as separate domains that for various reasons have been converging. And these are the kinds of conversations that will also come out in your discussion. So I don't want to take up too much time with me just going on. So I'm going to introduce our speakers and just I wanted to say a couple things to just sort of put a frame around this. With Arctic sea ice disappearing, as you all know, and Hollywood directors building their own deep water submersibles that are taking them to the deepest known point in the ocean, and global retailers and car manufacturers building their own vehicles to take them into outer space. Clearly, it's time to address this potentially volatile situation that we referred to as anarchy in sea and sky, ? And tonight we have 2 incredible speakers who are going to do just that. And our first speaker, Michelle Hanlon, is a co-director of the Air and Space Law program at the University of Mississippi School of Law and its Center for Air and Space Law. She's the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Space Law, which is the world's oldest law journal dedicated to the legal problems arising out of human activities in outer space. And she's the faculty advisor for its sister publication, the Journal of Drone Law and Policy. Michelle is also a co-founder and president of For All Humankind, Inc., which is a nonprofit corporation that's the only organization in the world focused on protecting human cultural heritage in outer space. In this capacity, she was instrumental in the development of the recently enacted One Small Step Act in the United States. And For All Humankind has been recognized by the United Nations as a permanent observer to the United Nations Committee on the peaceful uses of outer space. Michelle is the president of the National Space Society and the mentor to the National Space Society Legal Fellows Program. And she was recently appointed to the Hague Institute for Global Justice Off-World Approach Project. So Michelle, I'm going to turn it over to you. Can't wait to hear your remarks.
Catherine, thanks so much. And apologies, I wear many hats in space law and because I'm very passionate about it. But underlying everything that I do is really moving the humanity off of our Earth, not to forsake Earth or leave it behind, but because I think that's our natural evolution. I just want to thank Alexandra and Debbie for joining me today. Also, I am a student and colleague. I hope that you're able to stay for the group discussion because I think it's really going to be fascinating. So thank you, Catherine, so much for having me, for reaching out to have this conversation. I'm really excited to hear from Linda. I'm going to talk a little bit about outer space and space law. I kind of got a giggle when I see that air and anarchy in the air, because we don't know legally where air ends and space begins, right? We don't even have agreement with respect to space law about that. So it's really kind of phenomenal that we have agreements about anything related to space. But first I want to sort of orient our discussion. When we think about space, we always call it outer space, right? We always think of it as out there, something different, but it's not out there, right? We are in space. We occupy space. We need to disengage ourselves from this concept of it's something different and far away and out and beyond, that it's removed from us, because we are a part of the cosmos and we are an integral part of the cosmos. We are not an outside observer looking in. So this concept, it's very easy for us to sort of think, oh, outer space, who cares? Well, we have to care because it is our environment. We live in this universe and we contribute to everything that happens in this universe. So it may seem far away and alien and different, but it's only different because we haven't carved it up the way we've carved up Earth, right, into territories and nations. This doesn't mean it's lawless either. Roman legal tradition has long supported the concept that whoever owns the land, it is theirs up to the heavens and down to hell, which I find really interesting in the context of this conversation today. So the Roman legal tradition, that human desire to control nature, even in the air above us, was built into our psyche for centuries. And it's certainly a mainstay of our Anglo-American jurisprudence. So, of course, this was well before the Wright brothers, but you can sort of see people sort of thinking, I own everything, up beyond. As aviation grew, nations were rightfully reluctant to cede control over their own airspace, as humans were using air to actually attack each other. Even before aircraft, people were using hot air balloons to spy on each other and to throw bombs at each other. So it was codified in the Chicago Convention of 1944 that every nation has complete and exclusive sovereignty over the airspace above its territory. So here on Earth, we have a very hard and fast rule. Every nation in the world has acceded to the Chicago Convention. So we all agree that a nation, wherever our borders are, that those borders extend up into the air above that nation. And of course, I started this by saying we don't really know where air ends and space begins. And that's really important because in 1957, Sputnik orbited the Earth over many nations. So this was the very first object ever to blast out of our airspace into what we know is space. It's undeniably, and it orbited the Earth and it went over a lot of countries. So if it were airspace, it went over a lot of countries. They would have had the right to shoot it down, right? Because it was encroaching on their sovereignty. But that didn't happen. President Eisenhower did not object to this overflight of Sputnik. And no nation, every nation followed the United States example, and not one nation argued or expressed any dissatisfaction or objected to this overflight. And so what we had was what we call customary international law was immediately created, that space is something different from air, and space cannot be considered anybody's territory. So, and why did this happen? Because, you know, we like to look at history, and certainly there was this understanding that space has to somehow be different. But, you know, fundamentally, President Eisenhower wanted the same access that the Soviets had at that time. But President Eisenhower also did not want space to become another battlefield. And thankfully, as it turned out, neither did the Soviet Union. And so as the Cold War raged on, the US and the Soviet Union and their various allies created this United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and actually sat down and negotiated to figure out a way to make sure that whatever squabbles we were having on Earth did not follow us into space. Even at that point, when there had only been a few satellites launched into space, the recognition of how important space was going to be, how important having assets in orbit was going to be, even when at that point they were just little boxes, little blips, little balls essentially circling the Earth. The negotiators of the Outer Space Treaty understood the potential that we had in orbit. They understood, but think about the 1950s and 60s. They couldn't even conceive at that point. We hadn't landed a human on the moon. How could they even conceive of all of the things we would get and be able to do in space? But nevertheless, they sat down and they negotiated the Outer Space Treaty, which we consider sort of the Magna Carta for space activities. And that's important. It's a Magna Carta. It's not a constitution. It's more like sort of a declaration. So the exploration, the Outer Space Treaty has three very strong, very main and fundamental precepts that people consider now to be customary international law, meaning even if a country hasn't signed the Outer Space Treaty and 104 countries have, even if you haven't signed it, these will apply to you. The first is that the exploration and use of space is the province of all humankind. This is what 104 nations have agreed. This is really important when we're thinking about the future, because the province of all humankind is different language than what is used in other treaties. It's different from the concept of the heritage of all humankind. And so we have an argument within the legal community about whether space is a global commons or not, and all of the economic and legal sort of baggage that attaches to those concepts of a global commons. So outer space, what has been agreed by the nations is that outer space is something less than a global commons. And again, we know this because we have treaties where we've actually negotiated different language. The Moon Treaty, which was negotiated in 1979, although not ratified by many nations, and the UN Law of the Sea, which use different words, different ways to describe the area they are covering. So we have under the Outer Space Treaty that the exploration and use of space is the province of all humankind. We know that space is free for all. So for you, for me, for every nation, there are very few restrictions in the Outer Space Treaty on what you can do in space. What do we have? We have space is not subject to national appropriation. We have international law applies to space. We have no weapons of mass destruction or nuclear weapons may be placed anywhere in space. And we have the concept that activities in space must be implemented with due regard to the activities of others. One really unusual thing about the Outer Space Treaty is Article 6. So as you can imagine in public international law, if states do something bad to each other, they're liable to each other. We have a responsibility to each other to abide by laws, and we have vicarious liability for actions of our nationals. States have liability for actions of their nationals, but only if they've been authorized or only if they knew about them. So for example, think about if I were living on the border of the United States and Canada, if I went into Canada and I smashed up a tourist store, a knick-knack store right across the border, and I came back, and maybe the US would give me up and send me to Canada to be prosecuted, but I would not be the responsibility of the United States. The United States would not be liable for the damage that I did. That's different in outer space. We have a very different rule in outer space. Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty says each state is responsible for the activities of their nationals. So when we think about Elon Musk, when we think about Starlink, when we think about perhaps Starlink hitting a space station like the Chinese complained about just a few weeks ago, it's not, the United States is responsible for the activities of Elon Musk because he is a US national. And if his Starlinks, if his spacecraft cause damage, then the United States is liable and responsible for that damage. So this is the sort of a very different concept under international law. What's important to remember about the Outer Space Treaty is that it is only guidelines and principles. And so really what I just told you, the treaty is only 2 pages long. Really what I just told you are the fundamental and only sort of concepts. They are guidelines and principles. They are not rules and regulations. Also, they are, the formal name of the treaty is Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States. So except for that Article 6, which makes states responsible for the behavior of their nationals, this never contemplated private or commercial entities in space. So where does that leave us? So the first question is always enforcement. Can Elon Musk simply move to Mars and ignore international law? Certainly. I mean, what can we do? You know, we're not going to send Space Force out to get him, right? I mean, the truth is, as long as he's tethered, as long as a community is tethered to Earth to get supplies, they will have to toe some sort of legal line. But there's so many other questions. What if there's 2 communities on the moon? What if they want to mine the same patch of lunar ice? What if they interfere with each other? What entity will decide which patch each one is permitted to mine? And what about the nations that can't reach the moon yet? You know, don't those resources in space belong to them too? And how do we protect their interest in this province of all humankind? And also, what do we want? Do we want off-Earth humans to be aligned with a sovereign nation? Do we want to nation build on other celestial bodies? How can we assure our future selves don't build dystopias? Certainly, the realities of space will assure the loss of many freedoms, privacy being first and foremost, right? Because we have to share a lot. There's going to be a lot of small space living. But what about other human rights? The Declaration of Human Rights indicates that humans have a right to own property. Shouldn't that apply to property in outer space? If you think about our earthly history, property was used as a way to control populations. Slaves and serfs could not own property. Is that the kind of regime we want in space? Often it's also raised with me that humans should consider themselves custodians of nature, and using the example of many indigenous cultures. And yet when we look at the history of the First Nations in North America, even though they had a different relationship to the land than the Romans did, they certainly were not peaceful stewards of the nature, and they fought each other bitterly for access to and claims on certain property. Finally, today, property is bestowed through the function of the state. I think we need to change that. We need to remember one very important and fundamental truth. Laws were created to manage relationships between humans, and to some extent, the relationship between humans and certain natural resources. Laws created states. States do not create law, people do. So the question is, what lessons do we take from history as we look to the future? For me, I think it's time to move away from the sovereign paradigm. When I look at the first blueprint on the moon, Neil Armstrong's blueprint, I don't see it as an American accomplishment. I see it as a human one, because we don't get to the moon without our entire history of humanity, without one of our human ancestors standing up on 2 feet and freeing our hands to make tools, without one of our ancestors figuring out, oh, if I tally things together and I add them, I have the basis of math. Without one of our ancestors in Mesopotamia looking at the sand and realizing, oh, wow, I can make something clear out of this, and it's hard, and that's glass. So every endeavor we have achieved in space has been built on the foundation of all of our humanity, not on the foundation of our sovereign states. I think that's something we really need to think about as we think of the next evolution of the Outer Space Treaty. Thank you. I hope I wasn't too much over time.
Not at all. Wonderful, Michelle. Thank you so much. And I encourage any of our audience members who have questions, please put them in the chat. I'm already realizing that, wow, I've got a lot of questions. So much that as soon as you said it, it was like, well, of course, why didn't I never thought about that? first of all, this question of where air ends and space starts. I mean, will there not come a time where that delineation is going to have to be, I don't know what the verb is, decreed?
Absolutely. When you think about it, especially when we have two very different regimes, right? Space is free for all, and air is sovereign. And so, once you decide, we're starting to get a lot of suborbital flights. We're starting to think about hypersonic flight, and those are going to be taking place in that band that we haven't decided whether it's air or space yet. Only 2 nations in the world have actually delineated a fast line, in Australia and I think Denmark have put it at 100 kilometers, but there's still a lot of debate about where that line should be.
I would imagine. I mean, it made me think immediately, just because of my background in estuary science, how you measure, an estuary is defined by the amount of salinity in the water. And it's the same question that, you can take all of these measurements, but of course that fluctuates. So, but it doesn't quite have the same consequences as this idea about the difference between owned airspace and outer space.
Yeah, exactly. And when you think about that, even with a fine line of 100 kilometers, do you follow the Earth's terrain then? So is it 100 kilometers above Everest, or is it 100 kilometers above sea level? I mean, from a legal standpoint, it's fascinating and fun.
Right, which I live at least part of the time in New York City. And of course, I also immediately start thinking about air rights over buildings, and whether possibly would nations ever try to sell their air rights.
Exactly. I mean, we have nations who have sold their, some orbital slots have been preserved for developing nations who don't have satellites yet. And sadly, Tonga, it's a terrible week for Tonga, but they tried to sell those orbital rights and were soundly slapped on the wrist for it. But why? Why can't they sell something that valuable?
Right. There is one question in the chat. Michelle, what do you imagine beyond/after the supremacy of the system of sovereign states?
I have no idea. I think that I rely on human nature. I don't think it's something that is going to be able to percolate here on Earth. I think it's going to start with human communities that, for the first time, when they wake up in the morning, they're seeing Earth out their window and not the sun, or they're not seeing Earth anywhere at all. I think that is a mentality I can't imagine, and people on Earth can't imagine, and that taking that leap is, I think, what we're going to need to get rid of that sovereign paradigm.
Right. And one more question. Was there not, already a treaty made at one organization than the UN regarding the amount of, quote, contamination, unquote, that's limited to carry to planets, et cetera, aboard spacecraft? I'm thinking this treaty was created in the early 1960s, possibly earlier.
So I believe there is what we call the Planetary Protection Principle. So we have agreed that we will not harmfully contaminate other celestial bodies. And that is included in Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty. And it has been implemented largely by a body called COSPAR. And they publish guidelines about what you ought to be, they take celestial bodies and categorize them. So for example, the moon is a category 1, which means we're not worried about any biological contamination because we're pretty sure there's no biology on the moon. But the Mars is very different. And so there are a lot of protocols we have to go through to make sure any spacecraft that orbits or lands on Mars doesn't bring biological contaminants, because we want to make sure that we're not, messing up our own concept of evolution. I believe that we ought to be taking those rules one step further and thinking more about conservation of landscapes as well. But right now it's really focused on those biological contaminants.
And there's one more question I have to, I keep saying that, but that I have to ask you that's in the chat. Michelle, could robotic access to asteroids lead to a chaotic, quote unquote, gold rush? Which, if you think about the actual gold rush in California, that's a significant impact.
So I worry a little bit less about asteroid gold rushes there are truly a lot of asteroids out there. I'm very concerned about a gold rush, water rush on the moon. You know, the moon is a finite resource. I can hear the argument saying space is infinite, asteroids are infinite. There is going to be a problem. You know, there will always be that, hey, I got here first, who got there first? How are we going to do that? But in terms of that actual rush to get out there, there are a lot of asteroids. Again, I'm more concerned with making sure that nations that aren't necessarily spacefaring at this point aren't left behind. And so when I look at these treaties, I want to see more sort of universal acceptance, or you know, bringing up everybody with these access to these resources. And again, though, I do think I'm very concerned about the use of lunar resources. I think we need to be very responsible, act very responsibly there, or we're going to regret it.
Well, thank you. I think there are more questions, but there will always be more questions. Fascinating, and it's great to hear your remarks. And I hope you're going to be able to stick around and participate in our informal discussion afterwards.
Absolutely. I look forward to it.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, so much. And I would like to introduce our second speaker now, Linda Sheehan. And Linda, as Executive Director of Environment Now, Linda Sheehan guides philanthropic efforts to protect California's coastal, freshwater, and forest ecosystems. Prior to Environment Now, Linda served on the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation as senior counsel and was a consultant to foundations and state agencies. She implemented nature's rights programs as executive director and co-founder of Earth Law Center, led the California Coast Keeper Alliance as executive director, and oversaw Ocean Conservancy's work as Pacific Region Director. For her efforts in, quote, fighting pollution of the Pacific and the streams and rivers that flow into it, Linda was recognized by the state as a California coastal hero. Linda, thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thanks so much, Catherine, and thanks to you and Michelle and the team for the opportunity to speak today. And I had so many questions after Michelle's talk as well. We could sort of like talk endlessly, and I'm looking forward to the breakout groups to delve into some of these questions a bit more. Continuing the conversation, I'd like to explore how we think about the ethics of exploration and extraction in the deep sea. As you mentioned earlier, Catherine, we're rapidly changing the climate, we're accelerating extinction rates, and we're exceeding tipping points for Earth's carrying capacity. We look to space in the deep sea for solutions, but we don't have governance structures in place to effectively protect those systems and ourselves. Instead, we're working from our current playbook, which assumes that natural systems are economic entities first. And this is the approach that's gotten us into some of the challenges that we face today. I'll be talking over the next few minutes about options for an ethical 21st century legal operating system that ensures the well-being of the deep sea now and in the future. And apologies for those who know far more about this topic than I do. But broadly speaking, the deep sea is the water column below 200 meters in the international seabed beyond continental shelves. It's vastly underexplored, with 85% of the global seabed unmapped. By one estimate, 90% of the species that researchers collect in the deep ocean are new to science. Millions of square kilometers of ocean floor are currently under exploration for deep sea mining. One area of focus is the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, which is an expanse of the North Pacific between Hawaii and Mexico that's wider than the continental US. The three deep sea habitats of most mining interest right now are the abyssal plains, seamounts, and hydrothermal vents. These diverse habitats contain varying amounts of metal-rich mineral deposits, including manganese, nickel, copper, cobalt, rare earths, gold, and silver. There's wide agreement that the full extent of harm from potential extraction is unknown due to our fundamental lack of knowledge about this environment. We do know that mining impacts will include extensive habitat destruction, along with sediment, toxic noise, and light pollution. Scientists say biodiversity impacts are a certainty given the extraction techniques and the sensitivity of the habitats. And many also point to potentially serious impacts to the ocean's ability to store carbon. Deep sea mining in international waters is currently the purview of the Independent International Seabed Authority, which is established under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. The authority has been developing exploration and exploitation regulations known as the Mining Code over the last several years and has issued 30 exploration licenses so far out of 30 applications. The most recent news in this particular front is in late June of last year, in 2021, the tiny South Pacific nation of Nauru, along with its private industry partner, the Metals Company, triggered a 2-year clock for completing mining regulations that could open the door to global deep sea mining by July of 2023. Critics of the International Seabed Authority charge that it suffers from a strong bias towards mining in developing these regulations, and also has conflicts from fees collected from exploitation licenses, a lack of independent scientific support, and minimal transparency. So with that background, what are our alternatives for this ethical 21st century legal operating system? I'll offer 3 options. Option 1, the first option, this is the status quo, what I'm calling the Wild West approach. The current approach is grounded in our current neoclassical and neoliberal economic system, which assumes the natural world is property, or resources to fuel infinite economic growth that generates wealth benefits to an increasingly small subset of humans. It also reinforces the idea of humans as separate rather than in relationship with the natural world. One example here is the Independent Seabed Authorities, the International Seabed Authority's current mandate to race towards exploitation regulations over the next 2 years with little understanding of the ramifications, driven by what the Metals Company has called in its SEC filings a $95 billion mining concession with Nauru alone. The second option is commons-based law and the public trust doctrine, in which the natural world is co-managed in stewardship for the broader benefit of all. The International Seabed Authority, again, was created based on the understanding of the deep seas as the common heritage of humanity and was directed to act on behalf of all of the people. However, the commons approach still reinforces that anything other than humans is an object, not a subject of the larger Earth and universe community. Natural systems are still considered resources for human benefit, and so we continue to over-extract to our shared detriment. Not surprisingly, this is why we see the authority swinging away from its initial commons-based vision towards a more terrestrial Wild West mining model. So finally, the third alternative is Earth jurisprudence and the rights of nature. Jurisprudence is a term that means philosophy of law. Earth jurisprudence recognizes the inherent moral worth and rights of natural systems to exist and evolve, just as we humans claim that right for ourselves. This approach considers humans and natural systems as subjects of the larger Earth and universe laws. It draws parallels with our own human history of finding fundamental human rights as self-evident. The drafting committee of the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights stated that the supreme value of the human person did not originate in the decision of a worldly power, but rather in the fact of existing. The UN recognized that rights arise from existence. The rights of nature movements similarly recognize that the inherent rights of deep sea systems similarly arises from its own existence. Charles Darwin said that human moral development has involved the continual extension of our social instincts and sympathies outside our immediate community. Aldo Leopold extended this idea of community further to include nature, writing that we abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. This ethical framing actually matters in real terms. For example, it resulted in our celebrating the passage of an Endangered Species Act rather than a Healthy Species Act. Laws that regulate deep sea exploration and extraction would similarly be more protective under this ethical frame. The rights of nature movement has been escalating worldwide. At least 185 legal provisions recognizing nature's rights now exist in 17 countries spanning 5 continents and are pending in a dozen additional countries. The UN itself has precipitated 10 General Assembly dialogues on Earth jurisprudence, and the UN has set up a platform that compiles and analyzes rights of nature laws globally. As Michelle noted, we are an integral part of the cosmos, from our own backyard to the deep seas to space. Earth jurisprudence and the rights of nature are ethical and legal systems that reflect that understanding. So with these options in mind, what's next for the deep seas and mining? We talk a lot about innovating our way out of our current Earth-based challenges, but our focus is almost most exclusively on technological innovation. I don't understand why we limit ourselves in that way. And in fact, Gandhi warned against industrialization, saying that it would strip the land bare like locusts. Gandhi said, instead of economic greatness, our human greatness lies not so much in being able to remake the world as in being able to remake ourselves, a much higher bar than technological innovation. His insights are consistent with Earth jurisprudence and nature's rights approaches, which enhance rather than degrade our relationship with the deep sea. While we evolve to this new approach, if that's something that we choose to do, a resolution adopted by 37 nations at the International Union for Conservation of Nature meeting last fall outlines many of the steps that we can take to protect the deep oceans right now. These recommendations include the following. First, a moratorium on deep sea mining, including on new exploration contracts and on the adoption of exploitation regulations until certain conditions are met. A growing number of government bodies, major corporations, civil society, and hundreds of marine scientists worldwide are calling for such a moratorium. Second, comprehensive understanding of the environmental, social, cultural, and economic risks of deep sea mining. Third, application of the precautionary principle, the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, and the polluter pays principle to ensure that responsibility is fully on the extractor to ensure no harm. Fourth, policies to ensure the responsible production and use of metals overall. This includes our overall transformation to a circular economy, comprehensive recycling, and responsible terrestrial mining practices. And finally, overhaul of the International Seabed Authority to ensure transparent, accountable, inclusive, effective, and environmentally responsible decision-making and regulation. Each of these steps allows us to buy time to shift to a legal frame of respect and responsibility for the deep sea community, rather than accelerate in the unscientific dark towards destruction of our last Earth-based frontier. Thanks so much, and I look forward to questions and to the discussion in the breakouts.
Thank you so much, Linda. Really, the concept of nature's rights is so interesting. I feel like we could have a whole workshop discussion on that. People are already putting questions in the chat, so I feel like I'm going to put my questions aside and go to them. The first one is about the explosive event near Tonga that just happened, that created the tsunami. Didn't help our atmosphere and our efforts to fight global warming. Studies show that many nations are falling behind in promises to contain harmful atmospheric substances, other natural phenomenon, including disappearance of jungle areas and widespread animal resources for food, are contributing to global warming. Having stated this, are you aware of any remotely close estimate as to when the effects of global warming can be ameliorated, or have we passed the point of no return? That's a 64 kazoo.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, you know, I don't have if I had that answer, you know, I would certainly be able to say it. I would reference back to Dr. John Sturman, who is the director of MIT's Sloan School Systems Dynamics Department, who created a lot of the climate models and is an expert certainly in this particular area. And he said that we actually need to create a rights-based movement for nature. And it's his recognition that we need to change the game that we're playing, that we need to change our approach. And rather than sort of look at the distance and see that we're ticking our way inevitably toward this really problematic and seriously consequential result, why not step back and try to remake ourselves, as Gandhi talked about, and nature's rights, human right to a healthy environment. These rights-based approaches are things that we can and should start to implement as a strong strategy to help avoid the goals and the results that we're seeing.
Here's a quick question. I don't know if it's a quick answer. Is there a specific seabed authority, quote unquote, seabed authority?
Yeah, well, the International Seabed Authority, and if you Google it, their website will come up, is was appointed under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea in 1994 by the UN to take on these particular regulations and is preparing the mining code. And you can see the drafts of the mining code online that are there right now. But it's a volunteer operation. It's very little staff. They only meet once a year, and they don't have independent scientific support. So there's a lot of concerns about their ability to be able to effectively manage what is the last major global frontier.
And a question getting back to nature's rights, since humans are inherently biased and the legal system is designed for human relationship management, in our current legal system, the voice of quote unquote nature is brought into the courts through the human voice. How do we need to change our legal system to address nature's rights?
That's a great question. And it's one that I wrestle with constantly, because we have a legal system that is premised from a human-based perspective. If you look potentially like at the model of customary law, indigenous customary law, it's a very different approach when you think about what law is and how the voice of natural systems is recognized and brought forth in practices, in actual practices on the ground in that legal system. So I do think that one proxy in the immediate term would be scientific exploration and understanding and listening to science. And that's the challenge with the deep sea, is we just don't have the science that we want. I mean, hydrothermal vents were not discovered until really just a few decades ago, and changed our understanding not only of the oceans, but life on Earth and life in space completely. And what else haven't we discovered? I think science is going to have to be part of that voice, but we need to go ask a lot of these questions with a great amount of humility.
Indeed. And one final, I think this is a comment more than a question. The question about no return is framed in a difficult way. It's not a binary decision. Some changes have already happened and will not return, quote unquote, return to normal for hundreds of years, no matter what we do. But they don't kill lots of people yet. So that's, I guess, a comment on maybe what the future is going to look like. Well, thank you, Linda. It's 8:15, so probably time to get into our group discussions. I hope you'll be able to stay with us and participate in one of the groups. Thank you. And thank you so much for your remarks. So much to think about from both you and Michelle. And so at this point is when everybody's going to be put into breakout rooms, small groups, where there will be a facilitator in each group. And they are going to, the facilitators will lead the group through a discussion answering a specific question. There's 5 different questions. And then we will come back together after about 20 minutes or so and report out on what we talked about and the kinds of questions that came up. And I did also just want to mention one more thing, which is we have a new Facebook group. So after tonight, if you want to continue the discussion, and we certainly hope you do, you will be able to do that. And I think that Tiffany's going to put the Facebook group link up in the chat. Yes, and there it is. Great, thank you. Okay, and I think, Tiffany, you are going to put everybody into breakout groups, is that right?
Yes, I have you all sorted. I'm about to open the room, so it'll give you 30 seconds, 60 seconds, something like that to go into your rooms. And we'll get started now.
Great.